What I would have changed if I could start again. A reflection on pursuing movement work in Houston for 3.5 years. In 2019, I wrote an article about what I would change if I could restart my journey of multiplying until there is no place left. At the time, I had been in Houston a few years and was moving back to my home state, so it felt like a good time to reflect. That article must have struck a chord because people bring it up with me more than anything else I have written. One conversation I had with a friend in 2024 prompted me to go back and reread the article, and in it, I mentioned several things that I was planning to do differently going forward. I wrote footnotes analyzing whether or not my hypotheses were correct or wrong. I'm going to repost it here in case the Lord might want you to learn from my mistakes so you can be as fruitful as possible in your own ministry. I moved back to Raleigh, North Carolina in June 2019 after being a vocational missionary in Houston, Texas for over 3.5 years. I worked as a part of the No Place Left Houston Coalition, and we were seeking to have a multiplying church in every zip code of the Houston area by 2025. I write this in the genuine hope that others can read it and not make the same mistakes that I did when I started out trying to catalyze a church planting movement. I absolutely do not wish for you to think that I am criticizing anyone who has worked or is still working in Houston. I have a deep love and respect for those who I worked alongside in Houston. As always, hindsight is 20/20, and there was often no way that I or we could have realized that we were doing something that was hindering the mission work. In the moment, we were doing the best we knew how to do. I've written about some of the things that actually changed during my time in Houston, but I also offer a few hypotheses about what could be changed now to address today's challenges. While I'm no longer in Houston to test these ideas, I'm eager to see whether they prove true in the long run. Footnote: in the beginning of 2024, I decided to go back and reflect on what I said in this document to see if the hypotheses of my past self were true. I will explain if past me was correct in my footnotes after each section. Team. When I moved to Houston, I joined a small team of vocational missionaries. None of us had really been part of a team focused on catalyzing movements before. We all lived fairly close to each other at first, but because we were so driven by the vision of multiplication, we quickly felt we needed to work in separate areas instead of staying together in one. After about a year, we spread out across the Houston metro area. That meant it would take at least 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, to drive to see one another. Again, we made this choice because we wanted to reach the whole city and believed we needed to cover more ground to do so. Looking back, I realize it probably would have been more encouraging and less frustrating for me, and likely for the rest of the team, if we had chosen instead to work together in the same part of the city. We could have supported one another more consistently, leaned on each other's unique gifts, and shared the challenges and victories more directly. In hindsight, I dare say that when we spread out, we might have been trying to force the strategy forward rather than responding to the growth God was actually giving. Beyond just being in the same area, I think it would have helped to go together to meetings, trainings, and other ministry activities, only splitting up later if God brought so much growth that it became necessary. That way we'd be spreading out as a response to the fruit God provided, rather than trying to force multiplication before it truly took root. Footnote: Raleigh-Durham is not nearly as big as Houston, so I couldn't really test this theory, but I still do think that proximity matters. A different team in LA tested out this theory with great results. They basically did everything together until the work forced them to split up. There is a thriving network in SoCal now. Event trainings. No Place Left Houston has trained thousands of people across the city. We quickly got together swarm teams to train with us, to the point that there was regularly more than 5 trainers at each event training. We made set schedules to be used at gospel conversation trainings so that new swarm trainers could easily know what to do at each training. We did not have a set way that we followed up with churches after a gospel conversation training. Instead, we responded to what the churches wanted. I wouldn't change much about this, as I think the trainings accomplished their intended purpose. But there are a few tweaks I would have made. First, we were so eager to raise up other trainers that we asked people to train with us before they were ready. When we got people to train with us, they often were people who were enthusiastically trying to start sharing the gospel and following up with people. but they had not been doing the work long enough to get to true multiplication. This also meant that many of the trainers had not yet shown a willingness to persevere in the work. This led to various failures. Some people got put in front of a crowd, and that made them prideful. Some started to train so much that they gradually stopped trying to follow up and disciple folks, and even stopped sharing the gospel. When some people got in front of a crowd, they were viewed by their church as a leader, so they were put in leadership roles in other ministries, which quickly ate into their time so that they stopped making disciples. This didn't happen to everyone, but every one of these problems happened multiple times. To correct this, I would make a strict rule to only have people train who are actively doing the work and have shown their perseverance and character in the ministry. This would make the swarm team smaller, but would help everyone know that training isn't the end goal. Multiplying disciples in churches until there is no place left is the end goal. Footnote: I still really believe this, but I don't do event trainings hardly at all anymore. Most of my training is the daily walking alongside people and mauling the skills of ministry. I agree with my past self in that character development is essential if someone is going to actually make a disciple, and people will only train others if they are doers. Event trainings continued. Also, the best fruit of trainings was finding strong leaders in the work. Leaders are found when trainers share lots of vision and lots of stories of what God is doing. However, our trainings tended to be more tool-heavy than vision-heavy. I think this happened again because we made people into trainers too quickly. It's easier for new trainers to train on tools than it is for them to train on vision and stories. Thus, the trainings became mainly about the tools. I would correct this by not having people train before they could effectively communicate vision and stories. Footnote: our leaders now can vision cast really well. They can lead from biblical vision as they train on tools. Works way better than just being about the tools. Entry. At the beginning of my time in Houston, I primarily shared the gospel with strangers, usually going out 2 by 2 in apartment complexes. Eventually, we added door-to-door outreach. It was fun and stretching, but ultimately, it didn't lead to many long-term discipleship relationships or new churches. Over time, I realized that when people shared with their oikos, their natural network of family, friends, coworkers, and acquaintances, it led to sustained discipleship in churches far more often. So we made a strategic shift to focus on sharing with oikos as our main entry strategy. Looking back, I wish we had started this way from the beginning. In our early trainings, we taught people to make oikos maps, but then we immediately pushed them to go out and share with strangers 2 by 2. As a result, no one actually shared with their oikos. When we shifted towards sharing more with oikos, some people naturally tried to build new communities around themselves to reach more people. Some were quite gifted at this and saw fruit, but it often took a lot of time and energy and wasn't practical for everyone. On a recent group call with David Broderick, he made a point that stuck with me. There are already existing communities in cities through which the gospel can flow. This gave me a new hypothesis. Rather than spending so much energy creating entirely new communities, it might be more effective for most people to join pre-existing communities they can naturally integrate into, like a running club, a hobby group, co-workers, or other parents at kids' events. Strategically, this is one of the things I'm most excited to pursue right now, because I believe it could help the work advance more quickly and organically. After we shifted toward focusing on oikos, I did still see some people share with strangers in ways that did lead to sustained discipleship and gatherings. Early on, we often shared the gospel within the first 5 minutes of meeting someone. But the people I saw who got to long-term fruit usually shared the gospel around the third or so time they met someone. Another effective approach I observed was sharing with people near where a gathering was already happening, then inviting them back to that gathering. This led to several new disciples being added to house churches. Footnote: we still do mainly share with oikos, but we have seen some people join existing communities to reach the lost. To read my full thoughts on reaching existing communities, read my previous articles on my Substack. I have linked the previous posts in this post. Gospel. We primarily used the 3 circles to share the gospel across the city, and honestly, there isn't much I'd change about that. It was simple, reproducible, and effective. Where I do think we fell short was in training people on how to follow up and lead discovery Bible studies, DBS, with those they met. I've always believed that doing a DBS with non-believers is one of the most effective evangelism strategies. Looking back, I wish we had been more intentional about equipping people to start and lead DBSs as a natural next step after sharing the gospel. Footnote: we're seeing most people come to Christ through DBSs now, so I would say that this is true. Discipleship. When we first got to Houston, we were pretty apprehensive, if not outright opposed, to the idea of inviting someone back to an existing church and a home after sharing the gospel with them. Our strategy was to try to start a new church with every new person we reached, but in practice that rarely led to many new churches actually being planted. Looking back, I see now that it's often better to disciple new believers within the context of an existing church. Inviting a new disciple to join a multiplying gathering makes sense practically, and it also aligns with the biblical pattern we see in Jesus' ministry. Jesus never discipled people in isolation or one-on-one. Instead, he invited them to follow him together alongside others. That communal context is part of what shaped his disciples and fueled multiplication. Church. Before moving to Houston, I'd been part of a few 3/3 groups, but I had never actually been part of a church meeting in a home. So starting churches was completely new territory for me, which meant I learned a lot by failing forward. Needless to say, there's more I would change than I can list here. First, I think the initial churches we started felt too much like training groups. Training is essential, of course, but if we had simply modeled how to be the church, people would have been trained on church planting by watching and participating. It's good that we consistently practice the 3/3 format, but we used to rotate leadership of each part every week. In hindsight, I think this rotation contributed the most to making the gatherings feel like training exercises rather than genuine church life. Instead, I now think it's better, as a general guideline, for the church leader to lead all parts at the beginning. As people in the church who show a desire to start their own gatherings, the leader can give them more chances to lead, so they learn by doing in preparation to plant. Alternatively, roles could also be gradually handed off to people who feel gifted or passionate about particular parts. Someone with a teaching gift could cast vision, someone gifted in service could handle prayer requests, a shepherd could lead care time, and so on. This approach wouldn't just feel more natural, it would also help the church live out what Scripture teaches. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul tells us that every member should use their gifts to serve the body. And Ephesians 4:15-16 says that when each part does its work, the body grows in love and into the fullness of Christ. The biblical directive is pretty clear. The church flourishes when everyone is empowered to contribute, not just when everyone is trained. Footnote: this is the first part of this post that I would kind of disagree with my past self. I now realize that rotating the parts is not the primary thing that made our churches feel like training groups, so I'm fine with handing out different parts to the whole body. I still agree that if someone wants to start their own church, giving them certain roles to help them learn is essential, and if someone has particular gifts for particular parts, then it is fine to let them give more attention to those parts. However, now I see that everyone getting the chance to do different parts gives them the opportunity to grow in that area and become more Christ-like. If roles are only given out according to giftedness, then there is a risk of making certain people experts instead of empowering everyone in their identity as priests. Leadership development. At one point, we were really trying to figure out how to properly appoint elders. In our enthusiasm, we definitely appointed some people too quickly. Over time, we learned it's wiser to only appoint elders who are already eldering, those who others naturally see as their leaders. Another issue we've faced is that many of our apostolically gifted leaders are still leading most of the gatherings they started. Biblically, people with apostolic gifting should move on after starting a church so they can plant new works elsewhere. But often these leaders hesitate to leave because they don't believe there's anyone ready to step in. They worry the church will either become unhealthy or stop meeting altogether if they step back. I think in some cases that fear is unfounded. When Paul left the churches he planted, they sometimes struggled with sin or doctrinal error, But that didn't stop him from moving on. Paul left because God had called him to new fields, and that was the role he was gifted to fill. I think the apostolic leaders in Houston could benefit from setting clear guidelines to help them decide when to leave a church they started. I'm not entirely sure what those parameters should be, but a few ideas come to mind. Maybe they could commit from the beginning to leave 12 to 15 months after planting, which would create healthy urgency to raise up new leaders. Maybe they could plan to leave once the church has multiplied to the third generation. I don't know the exact answer, but I do believe the work would grow more rapidly if apostolic leaders learned to move on sooner, trusting God to raise up local shepherds and teachers to care for the flock they leave behind. Footnote: I wholeheartedly agree that apostolic leaders need to be planning their exit and letting people know that they will leave well before they actually depart. Now, after learning a bit more, I would add another reason why I, as an apostolic leader, had difficulty moving on. Since our churches felt a lot like training groups, there were only a few people who wanted to stick around in the church, and most of those people were very apostolically or evangelistically focused because they loved the training. Now that we have churches that have increased in doing the one another's, more people want to join us because they experience the love and community. Therefore, we have more shepherding people who can take on long-term leadership in the churches. This has given me the freedom to feel like I can move on with the church in good hands. I hope you enjoyed these reflections. Let me know in the comments or message me if there is anything that stuck out to you. Would love to have your feedback. Be sure to pick up my book, Movements in America, on Amazon if you want to learn more about how God is multiplying disciples and churches around the United States. The link is in the description.